The motivation for certainty, the motivation of knowledge, because this is where he starts. He starts with the idea that we should merely receive rather than even grasp. So the expression that he uses at the very beginning, we should immediately be receptive. We should be receptive, not in any way interfere into this, and apprehend it rather than comprehend it. Comprehend means begreifen in German, which is also the verb of the concept. So this is not a conceptual understanding. This is a purely sensible understanding in which we are totally passive. We are just receiving. And that's the certainty, because if we even so slightly try to comprehend it, we are adding something to it. And every adding from us is potentially problematic. So this is the motivation behind uncertainty. Are we clear about this? Any?
So like uncertainty is like it's sort of like it's like immediate knowledge.
That's the yes.
That's the motivation for it. That's why we want it.
But he wants to start there because that's perhaps our most basic, fundamental, immediate contact with the world. That's where we say we do not add anything, we do not comprehend anything, like Kant does, for example. We just we just apprehend it, we just receive it. Now, this is the motivation behind consciousness. Of course, this doesn't happen. So what Hegel does is to demonstrate why this actually doesn't happen. That kind of immediate certainty is purely empty, meaningless category, but he needs to go through this. He needs to understand the motivation. He needs to understand the motivation of consciousness, or articulate the motivation of consciousness, which was pretty dominant in the history of philosophy. When Locke says, like, it's just sense impressions, just receive it. Do not change anything. Do not have any kind of rational principle or any kind of human interference into our pure receptivity. And this is the model still in which we probably understand human perception. You know, and on the basis of that model, we are creating the replicas of this model. So when you sort of look at machines that we create that perceive stimuli like words or sees things and then responds to that, we do not really say like they have consciousness, they contribute anything to it, etc. They are just purely mechanically responding to what they take in, right? I mean, your Siri is really doing that. So you might, if you have Siri, of course, but or Google or whatever, like responding to voices. And then you say, do they hear it? Do they really take it to be true? Do they understand that sense certainty? And we take that to be really a question of certainty, like what happens? You say something, especially if you have an accent in English, they don't hear you, they don't understand you. They say, repeat it. And then you think that there should be a correct way of speaking and telling to that machine to respond properly. So I'm asking, like, show me the road. And then they say, what is broad? Like, no, it's road. I'm not saying broad. So like, it's just a matter of correctly pronouncing it. And we believe that that is the truth. That's the certainty. If you believe that to be accurate, certain, then that's how we understand perception. Now, perception in German is Wahrnehmung. Wahr means true. Wahrnehmung is already mean as perception already means to take something to be true. And so sense certainty is even before perception, before Wahrnehmung. So the end of sense certainty leads to perception. So there is even something more basic in sense certainty, namely that almost like a physical sounding world is right up your face, like it's going to impact you, and that's going to be the certainty. So this is the beginning. But when we think this is the beginning, the epistemological beginning, Hegel says, we have always already begun. So when I analyze the beginning, I am articulating a position that's not necessarily my position. And this is also part of the confusion in Hegel. Sometimes he makes assertions that he's going to undermine the next second. So then you are like, oh, we just said the opposite. Why are you saying that? So that's really what you need to think of, like phenomenologist, when he says we look at the consciousness and try to describe what is happening in consciousness. Sometimes consciousness is aware of what is happening. Sometimes it's not. Initially, it isn't. It just wants this sense certainty. So when Hegel says, wow, this appears to be the richest and the truest form of knowledge, in fact, it turns out to be the emptiest. Consciousness doesn't recognize that yet. So that's Hegel's judgment with respect to what's happening in sense certainty. So then we go back and say consciousness takes the object to be the foundation of sense certainty. Then we switch to consciousness's perspective, not from the perspective of the phenomenologist. And that might be confusing what he's saying, because he goes back again and then he describes the process again. And then you realize, well, they've already done this. Why are we going back? So this happens, for example, from the 92 to 93. He already explains the whole thing in 92. This is a mediation. It's never immediate. And that's two concepts that we need to really grasp and understand to make sense of this whole thing. Immediacy is, in sense certainty, the crucial starting point. That's our desire. That's the desire of consciousness. So immediacy, not mediated. It's just right up there, certain. You just receive it without any kind of filter, any kind of mediation, any kind of contribution of the mind. Almost like a physical process. Is that clear so far?
Okay. So this immediacy and sense perception, everything, are they do they correspond to Kant's intuition and receptivity and manifolds as such?
Well, in a sense, yes, but Kant already talks at the level of perception. He's already talking at the level of intuition being a presentation. Hegel perhaps goes even prior to Kant historically and conceptually, and tries to look at this first element of certainty in the senses. Now, of course, Kant doesn't believe that. Hegel doesn't believe that either. But by describing the process and saying that sense certainty is actually doesn't, well, does or does and doesn't. That's really the tricky part. This is our motivation with respect to our knowledge of the external world. But truth of that motivation doesn't manifest itself in sense certainty itself, but it manifests itself in perception. So this is the process that we described before. Now we are seeing concretely what we consider to be the truth of sense certainty is in fact going to reveal itself in perception. This is the dialectical movement. Now, the truth here is not simply certainty, because we take truth to be certainty. Consciousness does that. And sometimes we do think that. You know, whenever we talk about like the election results, we are still thinking accuracy, certainty, facts are the truth. That truth is this motivation behind uncertainty. Now, that's a motivation in terms of it's the motivation of consciousness. Therefore, it should be acknowledged. It should not be dismissed and pushed aside as irrelevant. But by going through that process, you actually reveal the truth of that process itself. So Hegel's approach to philosophy, or at least in this sense, the epistemological tradition, is that, yes, Locke expresses an important dimension of consciousness. Locke believing, like, I always give this example, it might not be the actually correct one, but sort of an empiricist. Like, how can you be so certain of something unless you are a tabula rasa, I mean, empty blank slate, upon which impressions are somehow thrown? That's our sensation. So yes, there's also his discussion of now, which appears to be very similar to Kant's notion, although in a different way, because Kant already talks about A, P, and cinnabar, things like that. Hegel says that's already too much. That's already too many words, too many language words like apple or A is a letter, etc. Just talk about without saying anything. Now, here, this. This is the most basic because you don't use a name, you don't use a concept, and you say this, you are not even describing it, you are just pointing out to it what it is. So that's the least amount of human intervention, least amount of intervention of the mind when you just say this. You are merely indicating the being of that thing that is in front of you. Look, there is this. And when you ask, like, what is the this, that's already a too complicated of a question. This is more basic and true to that notion of most basic element of uncertainty. So if we are clear about how it starts at a place that it could not have started, actually. So that's why it makes it complicated. We search for that immediacy, but once we reflect upon that sense certainty, that immediacy, we realize it's not even there.
Wait, the this that he's referring to is the immediacy? I know you just said we can't really ask what it is, but.
Well, we cannot say anything beyond the designation this.
But so like this is what? Just the present felt moment?
Yes, this.
Okay.
And you say, what is this? That's already too complicated. The fact that this uncertainty is really the certainty of the this. Now, am I certain of that it's a piece of paper? Paper. That's already too complicated. That already is a concept. So I am trying to get to the most elemental, most immediate, because you can say paper is already a concept. So you can say this, even this is a linguistic term and it is problematic, but he says like the most elemental pointing out, the most basic pointing out.
Sort of what is out there, the manifold.
Manifold is already too complicated because this is an instance. There's nothing that you can say other than this. Manifold is already a concept in Kant. He already uses the Mannigfaltigkeit. Like, I cannot even say that. I just say this. So this should characterize you, the motivation behind the idea of certainty and be certain about our sensations. And this, the beginning of modern epistemological question or the project, the traces of which we are still experiencing in this desire to get to the basic facts. It is what it is, period.
But that's pretty much impossible because as soon as we attribute anything to this, then it becomes conceptual, right?
Well, he goes through that and tries to explain that specifically, but basically, yes, that's the idea. But it is important how that takes place, because when people say, oh, well, facts are just interpretations, that's already saying too many sort of problematic things. How specifically it's not an interpretation, but a movement of consciousness with respect to the facts. That's what he's trying to articulate. So did you mostly read from the first or second translation? Second?
It's way, I wouldn't say easier, it's just clear. It's more clear to me. At least it's a second language student.
Okay, well, let's go with 2. It should be easier for you to follow the 2 if you already read it from the 1. But sometimes I will refer to the 1 because at least there are some things that the second translation, I mean, the best is to use the German, but does anybody read German? You read German? So you should read it from German, really.
Not yet.
Not
I'm just like intermediate. I don't know, even beginner.
beginner. Okay. Well, yeah. So I'll just go step by step, really. I mean, your frustration with the reading, maybe it could, you can ask me like, what does that mean specifically? So knowing, actually, Esther, why don't you read it so that
What page are we starting on?
the first 90, paragraph 90, page 60,
Give me just a second.
the first moment of sense certainty.
Mhm. Okay. Knowing, which is initially our object or immediately, can be nothing but immediate knowing, knowing of the immediate or of what is. Likewise, we ourselves have to conduct ourselves immediately or receptively. We therefore are to alter nothing in the object as it presents itself, and we must keep our conceptualizing of it apart from our apprehending of it.
Okay.
The concrete, oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah. This is what this is. So, is this problematic for anybody? Any question? So that comprehending, conceptualizing, literally means grasping. I said that multiple times. Begriff is the term for concept in German. So Begriff is grasping. So that begreifen is already maybe adding something from us. So we should not add anything. We should not alter anything. We should just receive it. This is the beginning. Now, we'll see how this beginning is actually never possible, and it's actually problematic, but that's where consciousness starts, because we take that as our object. So immediately, from a phenomenological perspective, we are seeing an act of knowing, sense certainty, moment of consciousness, a moment in the movement of consciousness, and what it considered to be its object. And it considers its object, already we can discern, but I don't want to confuse you, as its absolute opposite, namely that which is completely other than me, which I do not even alter, I just want to receive, other than me, because my contribution would alter something in the object. So this is the first elemental opposition between knowing and its object. Okay.
Is this the same as subject, object, kind of?
Well, those are already complicated. As you will see, he will say this and I. Yes, that will correspond to subject and object, but object is already a complicated term, which is not always the same at the movement of consciousness. Neither is consciousness itself not the same in its different moments. So yes, that you can say subject and object, but subject and object are already too conceptual. too many sort of thoughts and elements for like transcendental unity of a perception for Kant, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of already added elements in those. So therefore, yes, you can think of it as subject and object, but consciousness as sense certainty versus the object of sense certainty. So the words concept, I mean, here's the trick, like he already shows you that in the now, for example, you see that now is always through a negation. Its identity is not just a mere repetition of the sameness, but it is the repetition of the difference. Every concept in Hegel, you need to think along the same lines. Object is never the same, but it's always object. Subject is never the same at different moments of the movement of the dialectic, but we always refer to it as subject. Now we make the mistake then thinking that different moments of the movement of consciousness are the same. They are the same to the extent that they are all concepts that we refer to as subjects, but they function differently and sometimes opposite to each other. That's why it makes it very complicated for us to even understand what a concept is, because he says, book, this is a book. It is this, but not that, because it's also this. So you already have these opposition, negation, inscribed into what you consider to be a totality. That's why it gets confusing, because then you need to constantly rethink of the identity of what you are thinking in terms of opposition. And then you say, well, I just said this to object. Is it this or that? I don't understand. It's like, yeah, it's both. Understanding means locating him at different moments in the movement of consciousness. Does that make sense? I don't want to confuse you any further, but it is kind of how you live already. You already, when you use concepts, you are already doing that. But maybe the mistake is thinking that you are not doing that, and therefore get confused all the time.
Would you please repeat that last sentence about like understanding? What was it understanding? I don't know, like this and that thing.
Well, from now on, I should say like, it's recorded, you should listen to it.
Okay.
But that's like, rather than me repeating it. But like, if you ask a question, like, what is it that you are not understanding? Like, what is it that it is difficult? That would be easier. So I gave the example of concepts always being divided, concepts always being one thing and another thing at the same time, while one negates the other. And then you say like, what was the object? I just got the object in sense certainty and you just negated it. And you are contradicting yourself, you are confusing. And Hegel's like, no, this is the nature of concepts. Esther.
So I think I don't really understand how negation works. It's not just saying like, this is not another thing, like this cup is not the table, but it's saying that the cup is no longer a certain state in that philosophical movement. Like it's not comparing something to another thing, but it's comparing the thing to itself from a previous state.
Both. One is conceptual, the other one is the movement of the now. So when I use the term book, am I always referring to the same object? So what I do if I don't recognize negation is looking that which is the same in all books. This is a kind of Platonic understanding of the universal. What is common to all the books? What is common to all the books? And I realized, oh, I can't find anything. Ebooks, no, different colored books, the books that are like novels, the books, but there's nothing in common. Like I just search for this one problemless universal. Or I can think of the universal is already a kind of negation of different elements that relate to each other, which leaves it open. All of them are books. None of them is the book. One thing is opposed to the other thing. Two things that might appear to be the opposite of each other in one respect are united under the concept. This is the nature of language. This is the nature of conceptuality. When I say even now, I say this now is not the same as that now. That's how opposition, difference, sometimes negation. I mean, negation is not like necessarily a binary opposition. It's that, but also this moment is not the other moment. That's a negation. This book is not the other book, but both of them are books. And that moment is contained within the concept of the book. So both, I would say, to your question. Okay, 90 is done. Let's go to 91.
The concrete content of sensuous certainty permits itself to appear immediately as the richest cognition, indeed as a knowing of an infinite wealth for which no limit is to be found, whether we venture out into the reaches of space and time as the place where that wealth extends itself, or when we take a piece out of this plenitude, divide it, and thereby delve into it. In addition, it appears as the most veritable, for it has not omitted anything from its object, but rather has its object in its complete entirety before itself. However, this certainty in fact yields the most abstract and the very poorest truth. It
Okay,
expresses.
just one thing. So right there, he said everything that he said. Now he's going to go back to the moments in which we think that it is most veritable and the richest. So you get confused because he makes a statement here, but then he comes back to this statement and demonstrate how the richest and the most veritable becomes the poorest.
And doesn't, no, I was gonna say, like, doesn't he, or like he already sort of suggested when he talks about like it appears as the most veritable, like he doesn't say it is.
That's a good position. Yes, Arshainen. So he he says it permits itself, literally lets itself to appear in that way. So like he's already put that into this kind of like, this is not what it is, but it appears to be, because that's what we consider to be the richest and the most veritable because of its certainty. Because in modernity, we equate truth with certainty. To be certain. Now, certainty, already you see within the term of certainty a kind of complication. Like, am I certain? Is this about me? Or is it certain that the object is that? Is certainty a feeling? Of course, it's not a feeling. It's an epistemological position in which you are confident. But confidence is already complicated. So like, already in this certainty, you have this kind of human element that you want to get rid of, because you can never be certain. But that is that a element of consciousness. So anyway, don't get confused. So yes, you're right. It appears to be that way, but it's not. Okay.
Poorest truth. It expresses what it knows as this, it is, and its truth only contains the being of the item. For its part, consciousness only is in this certainty as the pure I, or within that certainty, the I is only as a pure this, and the object likewise is only as a pure this. This I, am certain of this item, not because I, as consciousness, have thereby developed myself and have variously set my thoughts into motion. It is also not because I, as consciousness, am certain of this item for the reason that the item of which I am certain would be a rich relation in its own self according to a set of differentiated conditions, or would be a multiple comportment to other items. Both have nothing to do with the truth of sensuous certainty. In that certainty, neither I nor the item have the meaning of a multifaceted mediation, nor does I have the meaning of a multifaceted representing or thinking, nor does the item have the meaning of a multifaceted composition. Rather, the item is, and it is only because it is. For central certainty, this is what is essential. This is pure being, for this simple immediacy constitutes its truth. Likewise, as a relation, certainty is an immediate pure relation. Consciousness is I, nothing further, a pure this, and the singular individual knows a pure this, he knows the singular.
Okay, there are multiple complications here, of course, because he wants to characterize the state of consciousness, state of sense certainty as not multifaceted. It is just simple. It is immediate. But he is already also in the process of complicating that, in the process of saying actually exactly what appears to be this simple turns out to be much more complicated to consciousness, to sense certainty itself at some point. But he already also posited a relationship, even from the beginning. You are talking about a relationship when you are talking about sense certainty, something that is certain I and something that I am certain of. So that's already going to complicate things, as we will see. But at this moment, what consciousness wants is this pure immediacy. Let's just go along with it. Let's just go along with the desire of consciousness in sense certainty to have just this, nothing added, just immediate pure. And I'm not like this complicated individual and consciousness, concepts of understanding, blah, blah, transcendental unity of a perception, etc. But almost like a mechanical I in front of the this that is certain.
Does he like? Okay, no, go ahead.
What do you mean by mechanical?
Well, mechanical in the sense that it's not, don't even think of it like a thinking human subject. It's just that it's a sort of cut segment of consciousness that at that moment, like you don't think of anything else. You are just only are to the extent that you are present to that this, to that this, to this.
I was gonna ask, like, so does he in this paragraph? Does he sort of give us like a hint of his own idea of like what certainty actually should be? Like, like the part where he's like, because like where it starts for its part, consciousness only is in this certainty is pure I, or within that certainty, the I is only as a pure this, and the object likewise a pure this, I'm certain of this item. And then when he starts going, when he goes like, I am certain of this item, not because, but like the things he says in that not because, is that sort of like a suggestion of what he thinks certainty should be like developing myself and setting my thoughts in motion, like a rich relation in its own self, according, and all that. So is that a bit of like a pre-suggestion?
Well, I guess the insight here is that the more complicated things become, the more complicated you understand the this, the more complicated you understand the I, it becomes more difficult to be certain. So certainty, the simpler it is, the most basic, elemental, undifferentiated, immediate it is, the more possibility of certainty. So he is not talking about a complicated notion of certainty rather than the pure presence of the this to the pure presence of the I. So now we are looking at this and we're like, what is consciousness? Nothing, just I. What is the object? Nothing, just this. Can we get certainty here? Because if you are talking about a human being and a book, that's already too complicated. So most elemental. Now, I am certain there is a book in front of me, but I'm also in one sense wrong about it. So that's already too complicated. Can I at least be certain this? And you will say, who are you? Nothing. That which is present to the this. That's what I am.
How are you supposed to isolate this from everything else, I guess?
In the element of certainty.
Like, because it's about immediacy, right? Like, but you would, I mean, you already have to have immediacy in order to have like a this, but how do you know that a relation is immediate, that like this has like defined boundaries? Because in order for you to be present with something, you have to know to what degree, I guess, not to what degree, but to where this ends in order to have immediacy with it.
Yeah, I also wonder that by saying this, I thought that the category, I mean the Kantian category, like for example, quality here is already, you know, engaged in this process because you're just, how to say, specifying this, or like separating this from that and that.
You are both right. I mean, but you are already thinking about it in a too complicated way, and Hegel would agree with you, but he is inviting you to imagine the possibility only to see that it's not impossible, that only to see that it's impossible, as you say. So imagine it as a kind of phenomenological thought experiment or something. Like if we were to imagine consciousness being purely present to the this without quality, without anything, nothing other than what it designates. This, that's it. When you say quality, you are already thinking about it. You are already intervening in like, and then you say, how do I know? You are already thinking. We are just sort of abstractly maybe thinking about the most basic confrontation between the consciousness and the world. Yeah.
So in, this is a little bit further down, but in 98, where he says like, here there is not a tree, but rather a house, is the this like if I can imagine turning and facing one direction, there's a tree, turning and facing the other direction, there's a house. So the this is like is like the entire image, not or
Yes.
the entirety of
That's already too complicated. You are right. I mean, he gives an example. I mean, when you say house, you can't really like be certain as that as here. He gives that only as an example of you changing your perspective.
Yeah, but so like whatever it is that's in front of me, the entirety of the image is what is the this.
Well, it's
Like,
not even an image, but yes, I would say yes.
or the entirety of like not the image, but like the thing that I'm facing.
Yeah. I mean, we are trying to understand what certainty is. Hegel is also trying to understand with us what this epistemologist says, that basic sense impression. Now, that proves to be much more complicated. It's almost impossible to even describe. And that's why he's going to say, we can't describe it. We can never say what we mean to say. But he is trying to get you to put yourself into the position of appreciating the significance of certainty that human beings have with respect to the world. How am I certain? Drop even knowledge. How am I certain that this is in front of me? How am I certain of this? How am I even certain that I have a relationship to the world? Right? Because knowledge is predicated on this, that I have a connection to the world through my senses. Right? And we search certainty for that, and we trust certain discourses in that certainty, like experimenting, scientific, just looking at it, blah, blah, blah. So that's the most basic elemental connection. Think of this connection as abstractly namely as simply as possible, the I and the this. Take out everything that you might possibly think about it and think of the most basic elemental contact between the world and consciousness. Now, of course, that will turn out to be not the case. So, in fact, it is going to be much richer, much more complicated, etc. But consciousness imagines at the beginning this to be a most fundamental, unmediated, immediate connection to the world. And he goes along with that. Let's move along with consciousness and see where it's taking us. It's not saying, like, it's one thing to say like, oh, we never have that relationship. It's another thing to place yourself into that relationship and see how you cannot have it. That's the difference between philosophical thinking and philosophical description. Like people say, we never have immediate objects. I don't care what you think. Go through the process and see how you end up where you end up. Then I will believe that truth. Because truth is not the proposition that you say at the end as your opinion, but it is that movement in which you demonstrate. So the best way would be like, there is no immediacy. Let's assume there is, and then how do we move? That's the philosophical argumentation. Not stating my opinion against your opinion, but let's take your opinion and move with it. Let's move with luck. Let's move that there is uncertainty. What happens?
Yeah, I guess this is one of the things that makes it a bit hard to read because you don't like you can't really tell what he's like what he thinks and he's saying versus what like he's moving through, and it makes it like it gets really muddy fast.
So everything he says is true and false. That's why it makes very complicated to read, because everything he says negates what he said before, at least in this movement. So therefore, we are going to just step back and see the process, and I will sort of indicate like, okay, well, is that even possible that this I and this here is given to each other immediately? Hegel says, this is likewise as a pure I this. Now you might get the impression that Hegel thinks that it is possible for this to be given. But that's a movement of thought, not actually happening, because this is not his opinion. Now, once we assume that, we'll see what will happen and then realize this could not even have happened. That's the difficulty. That's the complication. Therefore, it gets like he's not sort of telling his opinion. In fact, all of this is also at the level of sense certainty. Something to be resolved here, the idea of sense certainty. But that will only because it will become perception. That will be another level of consciousness in which different complications will arise. At that stage, we are not even searching for the this anymore because we already passed that stage. So in 92, for example, let me read this. However, if we take a look at it, there is a good deal more in play in this pure being. So he already says it, right? Which constitutes the essence of this certainty and which declares it to be its truth. An actual sensual certainty is not only this pure immediacy, but also an example of it. So one instance, it is translated in the other one. Beispiel. Beispiel, really German word for example, is really like play along type of thing, Beispiel. So it's like one, like you sort of say, oh, I'm certain of this, now I'm certain of this, I'm certain of this. This is just one instance of it, not the entire sense certainty or sensual certainty. Along all the countless differences thereby popping up, like you look, right? We find in every case the chief difference, namely that in that certainty, both the already noted this is, namely this as an I and a this as an object. So he also sometimes refers to I as the this, therefore it becomes more complicated, precipitates all at once out of pure being. If we reflect on this difference, it turns out that neither the one nor the other is only immediately within sensuous certainty, rather both are mediated. I have certainty through another, namely the item, and this likewise is within certainty through another, namely the through the I. But he already said this. This is the conclusion. He finished. It is not only we who make this difference of essence an example of this immediacy and mediation, rather it is we find this difference in sensuous certainty itself. Here he refers explicitly as we, the phenomenologists, as opposed to sense, it is this difference is within the sense certainty itself. I have, whatever the I here, I has, let's say, I has the sense certainty recognition of this is different than this and this is different than this. Multiple sense certainty. So this one is only an example of it. Just because I am certain of this here doesn't cover all the elements of sense certainty, because when I turn around, as was saying, when I turn around, I have another certainty. And that certainty is different than that certainty. Okay? Clear so far?
When he says both are mediated, can you like break that down, like mediation?
Well, this is going to be the sections 102, no, 101, 102. So what he said here, namely, I have certainty through another, and likewise, the other is within certainty through another, namely through the I, is something that he explains in sections 101 and 102. So he says it here and then comes back to it. So we'll come back to it. But if I explain it now, then 94 would not make much sense, because this is this sort of circular process in which he is describing sense certainty by going to different places. So at the beginning of this process, there are certain assumptions, and as you move, namely, you cannot have this without the I. So he hasn't demonstrated yet why I have certainty through another. He hasn't demonstrated that. He just stated that. In 101, he's going to come back and demonstrate that. That's why it becomes more complicated to read. So I cannot, because, well, I mean, he starts out immediately, but let's just wait for that. It will come. That's what we are trying to describe, how I is mediating the this and how this is mediating the I. Okay?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted, I just kind of want to have a sense of mediation in, like, because I have a different sort of understanding of what mediate means, and I just don't want to confuse with because it seems like sometimes like immediacy, sorry, as contrasted with mediation sort of has a complication where they kind of are implicated.
Okay, let's talk about the mediation. What do you understand it? How do we understand mediation? Yeah.
I thought of it, I keep reading it as a sort of like, it's the step after you get the immediacy, you get the different sense certainties of all the different this and I's. And then you kind of mediate them all together to create your perception of whatever is going on. It's both like evaluating all of them, bringing them all together. I think I keep misreading it as meditation. Sort of thinking about all of them, or building relationships between the different sense certainties.
Well, but that's true, even though it's not meditation. Uh, I think maybe immediate gives us the best clue. Immediate, unmediated, without any relationships, without any division within its being, not being constituted in terms of anything else other than itself. Mediation is to be what it is through the other, establishing a relationship, establishing a connection. So
Yeah, I was gonna ask if like the mediation is what happens after the this has an interaction with the I, like, or like after that, because it says like, you know, like the object is indifferent as to whether it is known or not. But like for us, like we're not indifferent. Like the phenomenologist is not indifferent to whether or not the object is known or to knowing the object. So like once once we have moved past the like sense certainty, then like we know something through. I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand either.
well, you were on the right trajectory, except the first immediacy that consciousness desires proves to be impossible. So even though we are starting with that assumption, what consciousness recognizes is it cannot have what it wants to have. Whenever it expresses that, it expresses the universal. And therefore, the truth of sense certainty, even as a feeling or even as the first moment of sense certainty of consciousness, reveals itself in the mediation, in the process. So the truth is never what it corresponds to the object in one stage. It is the movement from one to the other and back, and then the other and back. So the truth is that movement there are different moments of this movement that appears to be described and appears to be in a certain way. And yes, maybe that's the truth of that stage, but that's not philosophical truth. Philosophical truth
So
is the movement.
according to Hegel, would it be like um truth requires like two entities or two, because in order for there to be a relationship there must be two things?
At least two, yes, and it is
Well, two or more, I guess, but at least two.
and the movement, yes, yeah, because it's a relationship, but it's not a static relationship. Because I mean, you can already say, like in previous philosophers, truth is already a relationship. You can say for everybody, truth is a relationship in a fundamental sense because it is the correspondence between two things. Even the most basic analytic philosophy correspondence theory of truth is whether our, with Kant, for example, whether our cognitions correspond to objects or object corresponds to our cognitions. That's the question of truth in terms of relationship.
But like, so I understood the distinction to be like in Kant, like it's not through the object, whereas for Hegel it is through the object that the relationship develops. For Kant, it's the object as like an externality, right? Like the whole, all of the distinction for like what is epistemological and things like that about like the object. But for Hegel, there's not like a distinction. I mean, it's simply because it's simply just this like one moment or the immediate moment. Like it's, so the relationship is able to be through as opposed to like not, I don't want to say projected onto for Kant, but like it's not through the object in the same way that like it's through, yeah.
For Kant, it's the object too. I mean, I mentioned that at the end, transcendental unity of a perception is also predicated on the object. So you only have transcendental unity of a perception in relation to the object. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. So there is a kind of mutual constitution in Kant, but for Hegel, Kant is a moment within the movement of consciousness, not the entire consciousness, because Kant takes consciousness or reason or even understanding as stable, unchanging power. It's always the same categories. It is always the same power again and again with respect to our relationship to the world. But for Hegel, it's a movement. So Kant's discourse itself undermines itself, as you already noticed, by talking about something that you cannot talk about in time, namely the status of transcendental discourse. You are actually moving consciousness beyond epistemology, beyond mere epistemology of external world. So for him, unlike Kant, the consciousness and the object continue to constitute itself, not just once. For Kant, it's once. He demonstrated the possibility of knowledge, that is it, and this is the knowledge, blah, blah. For Hegel, that's not where it stops. That mutual constitution continues, and truth is a process in which both of these elements are transformed. And the truth of the previous transformation is not the same as the next one. Philosophical truth is different than scientific truth. Therefore, truth is a movement, as it might reveal itself in the absolute knowledge, not just a property of one stage. So sense certainty, like we take certainty to be the truth in modernity, let's say. We just want to be certain of things. Facts, give me facts. This is the truth. Facts are not truth. Facts are facts. They are not the truth because they, by definition, undermine themselves. I mean, that's the nature of fact. Like if it is X today, it's not X tomorrow. It's not truth. It is one instance of the movement of truth. But it's not. So, but it's not the entire truth. So Hegel is looking at the entire movement of thinking, of reflection, of consciousness, rather than one snapshot. Okay, it takes me 20 years, so it will take you a little long I mean, at least 20 years, not even, maybe more. I mean, so yeah, it's hard, I understand. But we'll make a little bit of more moves. But is mediation at least clear in terms of mutual relationship that transforms those that are in relationship? That's mediation. Now, initially, we don't want that. That's why we want to insist on the immediacy. Human consciousness wants the immediacy because mediation already recognizes a change, a transformation. So sense certainty, by desiring immediacy, by wanting immediacy, wants to establish something without relationship in itself, wants to know the object in itself. And the irony is that in itself, even at the level of sense certainty, is already defined in terms of the I. That this is the opposite of the I. That which is known by the I is not the I. That's the whole point of knowing. That's why I don't want to make the this anything like me. I want to keep it in itself, unmediated, immediately, just grab it. Not even grab it, like let it hit me. Which appears to be a stage in the movement of consciousness, but it is negated. And we will see how it is negated, specifically how that takes place. Maybe I was wrong. We will not cover 66 pages in the last 3 weeks, but only 8. That's cool with me. I don't care. Maybe if we get through sense certainty in 2 weeks, that will be enough. Okay, let's take a break and breathe a little bit. I'm gonna try to finish at 11:30. When we move from 92 to 93, it's really, this happens multiple times in the text. It seems to be a stepping back. So it is, so going back to what he said actually in 91. So 92 is already said too much, maybe, as a paragraph, but that's how he writes. That's how he sort of moves, but we'll just paint the picture of this trajectory where he says what, when, why is that important? So he goes back in 93. Yeah, Esther, can you read this? 93.
93. It is not only we who make this difference of essence an example of immediacy and mediation. Rather, it is that we find this difference in sensuous certainty itself, and it is to be taken up in the form it has in sensuous certainty, not in the way we have just determined it to be. It
Okay.
is posited. Sorry.
Yeah, the term very important here is the notion of essence, which means Wesen in German, the essence of something. And that Hegel believes the truth of something. So not the correspondence, not the certainty, etc., but the truth of something is its essence. It is revealing itself in its movement. Now, this is what Aristotle even defined ousia, the being, as that which has been. And Wesen is the term for essence in German, but gewesen is the past participle of to be. So when he says something has been, namely its previous moment, that's part of its essence. And that sounds like a word play, but it really exemplifies or sort of explains Hegel's understanding of what essence means. It is the movement of its being. It is what has been together with what is. That's the essence. So it concept reveals its truth in this movement of what has been. So therefore, he is looking for the truth of sense certainty. And one example of it doesn't really give the truth of sense certainty. So this distinction manifests itself in consciousness, in sense certainty, not just in phenomenology, but in sense certainty itself. When I say, this is sense certainty, well, that's two, and that's two, and that's two. So we don't say like, oh, look at this moment, and this is going to reveal everything. Of course, we say, in each case, when we concentrate on the this, sense certainty things, that's going to reveal the truth. But it's wrong. But it at least recognizes that there are separate examples of sense certainty, which is different than its essence. Is that clear?
Yeah, I guess when you said mention Aristotle, I thought of substance.
Yeah.
For a sec, is that like the same as?
Well,
Are we talking about the same thing?
it's going to be subject, not substance, but we skip those parts in the preface. But it is something about the past, what has been. So this really confusing section 106 and 107 especially, that will make more sense when we establish this, what has been, as a part of its essence. And that's really Aristotle's definition. I can find that in metaphysics for you next time. I'm sure Kevin mentioned it to you multiple times.
What?
I'm sure Kevin must have mentioned that multiple times, Aristotle's conception of ousia, no? Well, maybe you don't remember. I mean, okay. So, okay, go on, go on.
Um, um,
Can I ask a question, please?
Sure.
So, um, is there any relation between Hegel's essence and Ding an sich? For me, it sounds like Hegelian essence um, is not Ding an sich, but the immediate contact that we make with them. I mean, it,
Um, I can't define thing in itself as that with which we don't make a contact.
yeah,
So,
mhm. But Hegel says that, but we still can have relation with them as object that is against my consciousness. That is,
sure. But I mean, I think you are jumping ahead. And that really, Hegel understand that as a moment of in force and understanding. So when that's the third moment of consciousness, sense, certainty, perception, and understanding, force and understanding, that's where he talks about thinking itself in a Kantian sense. But if you are talking about, because thinking itself is really different if you are talking about it in terms of at different levels of consciousness. What thing in itself is for sense certainty is not the same as perception, as not the case for understanding. That which we cannot know really depends on which we are trying to know. So at some level, the thing in itself of sense certainty can be known as the next moment, in the next moment, that's perception. So that's only going to confuse you. So I don't think you should make just those types of parallels that might, without like reading the whole phenomenology, that will confuse you further.
Why didn't we do why didn't we do only Hegel for this class?
I don't know. Because there is no other, there is no class in which we do Kant. So it used to be like we had Kant and 19th century, but there are other people. I mean, there are other philosophers other than Kant.
So we don't have a class for Hegel. We just have this.
Well, I mean, when we had more, okay, stop. Okay, so we were, rather it's a difference, and it is to be taken in the form that it has in sense certainty, not in the way we have just determined it to be. So this is a really crucial distinction on 93 when he says, rather it is what we find this difference in sensuous certainty itself. And it is to be taken up, so kind of discussed, in the form it has in sensuous certainty, not in the way we have just determined it to be. When did we determine this to be? About in 92, we have determined to be in terms of mediation. So now we are going to the pre-mediation understanding. So like, how does consciousness in the form of sense certainty do this mediation? It is going to do it, but we need to start with the process of mediation itself. So it is posited in sensuous certainty as the simple immediate existence, or as the essence, the object. Esther, read, please. However, it is, yeah.
However, it is posited as what is other than the inessential and the mediated, which is not in itself in sensuous certainty, but which instead is through another, the I, a knowing that knows the object only for the reason that the object is, but which itself can just as well be as not be. However, the object is, it is the true and the essence. The object is indifferent as to whether it is known or not. The object remains even when it is not known, but if the object does not exist, then there is no knowing.
Okay, so from the perspective of sense certainty, therefore, when sense certainty wants to be certain, what it does is to put the essential element to the object. Object is the essential element in sense certainty. Now, that will turn out to be not the case, but consciousness in the first instance thinks as the object as essential. I am secondary. I is secondary. What is essential is that which is the object. And that object here is, again, this sort of difficult use of the term, because it's not an object like a pen or a book, etc. The object is that which is the content of sense certainty, namely this. This now is the first designation of the object. But that object needs to be constituted step by step. That's going to move from sense certainty to perception, etc. So object is constituted, not like materially constituted, but understood as what it is. What is it that consciousness refers to when it uses the term object? In sense certainty, when it says object, it is only referring to the this, and considers that to be the essential element. It's not that my certainty that is at stake, it is the certainty of the object. If there is a certainty, that emanates from the object, not from me. And that's pretty obvious, because I can be certain of things without them being true. But if we attribute it to the object, then that's where the certainty relies. So this is kind of the objectivity, the obsession of objectivity of consciousness. Is that clear? So the first moment is in the object. Even though it will turn out not to be the case, consciousness thinks that it is that first. Are we clear on this? So see, we read 1, 2, 3, almost 4 paragraphs, and everything is clear, right? Okay, let's concentrate on the object.
94. The object is therefore to be considered in terms of whether, in sensuous certainty itself, it is in fact the kind of essence which sensuous certainty passes it off as being. That is, it is to be considered as to whether this, its concept, which is to be the essence, corresponds to the way it is present within that certainty. To that end, we need not reflect on the object and mull over what it might be in truth. We need only consider it as sensuous certainty has it in sensuous certainty itself.
Okay, so we are not engaged in this complicated analysis what the object is, which turns out to be very complicated, but just like what does sense certainty considers it to be? Sense certainty itself, which doesn't have the perspective of the phenomenologist who sees the object already mediated, etc., as he explains in 92, but he is looking at it from the perspective of the sense certainty. Yes.
Is this still not when we start giving the object different characteristics, like it is red, it is square?
Not
Okay.
no, nothing. The object is still this.
Okay. So it's just making the distinction of like this is the object. That's all that it is.
It is just making this distinction what consciousness considers to be the essential element in sense certainty. And it gives that essential characteristic to the object. So what is important, what is fundamental in sense certainty is the presence of the object, not the presence of consciousness. That's what consciousness thinks in the first place. That's why we started with sense certainty, because we want to be, we don't want to just feel certain, we want certainty in the world. I mean, I can feel certain about stupid things and about, wrong things. But here, sense certainty is absolutely true. certain in the object. Now he says, let's look at that. Let's look at it not from a sort of complicated definition of object, but let's look at it from the perspective of consciousness itself. That's phenomenology. So, somebody else wants to read, or are you happy with Esther? Are you happy, Esther? Okay, go ahead.
Therefore, sensuous certainty itself is to be asked, what is the this? If we take it in the twofold shape of its being, as the now and the here, then the dialectic which it has in itself will take on a form as intelligible as this itself. To the question, what is the now, we answer, for example, the now is the night. In order to put the truth of this sensuous certainty to the test, a simple experiment will suffice. We will write down this truth. A truth cannot be lost by being written down any more than it can be lost by our preserving it. And if now, this midday, we look at this truth which has been written down, we will have to say that it has become rather stale.
Okay, so let's just step back and sort of go through this. And so he says, space and time fundamentally refers to the this. So this moment, this now, here, this. So that's one element. Now this is like something like a form of intuition for Kant becomes a object of discourse. Therefore, it becomes like an object. Now as time is an object, but it's a different type of object. It's not an external physical object, but it is a concept. Namely, it's something that we can discuss and discursively construct. And consciousness does that. So we say, now is day. Write that down. Now, what he is really articulating is a kind of response to a Heraclitean world. Now is never the same. This is the nature of our sensuous perception. So sensuous sensation. I don't want to say perception because perception is going to come later, but sensation. The certainty is always something that goes away, right? So what I'm certain of is a moment within a flux of moments. So the moment I say now is day, it becomes night. Now the question is the now day or night? Which one is it? Which one is it?
They wouldn't the answer be it's both?
What's that?
It's both.
Yes, but one is the opposite of the other. How can they be both?
Another moment. It's just another moment in the movement, in the philosophical movement. It's still like this same.
Exactly. Now it is, well, read it. You have the answer, 96.
Is it because the cows are black at night?
No, that would be an empty universal. That would be the sort of abstraction in which all nows are the same. Because they formally participate within a category, well, within a time of now. That would be the like parallel to that. All cows are black at night, right? Because their content is different, because not all cows are black, but there is one form, night, according to which everything appears to be black, in the sense that we see the now as always the same, self-same, without understanding the differences within the now. So, but now is something different. It's not a formal inclusion, but a universal, which Esther is gonna read. Okay.
96. The now, which is the night, is preserved, i.e., it is treated as what it was passed off as being, namely as an existent. However, it instead proves itself to be a non existent. To be sure, the now itself maintains itself, but as what is not the night, likewise, it maintains itself vis a vis the day, which it now is, as what is also not the day, or it maintains itself as a negative as such.
Here is the negative, negative day and night. Those are two separate moments, one negative of the other, not in the sense of negation as, again, as I said, binary opposition. And it's kind of binary opposition, but it doesn't matter. Day is not night. Night is not day. Now you can say, well, can it be not something else? Sure, but I mean, it doesn't have to be like a binary opposition, but it is that moment of time moving as negating itself. So for Hegel, ultimately, the nature of the world itself is dialectic. So he really articulates a Heraclitean world in which the change is articulated dialectically. So it is the negation of what has been. Now, this is important because sometimes this, I'm going to jump a little bit, like this articulates what the future can be. And for Hegel, a lot of 21st century, or not a lot, but some 21st century philosophers talk about this notion of the openness of the future. Like Derrida, when he says l'avenir, which is a concept of to come, which is something that cannot be calculated, cannot be understood, programmed, or predicted. What he's talking about is a kind of response to this kind of Hegelian understanding of the future, which can only be the negation of what has been. So the future is always already determined by what it negates. So it cannot be just this radically different one. And that's what Hegel is articulating. The now that is different, the next moment, is the negation of the previous one. So therefore, it speaks to his understanding of the spirit and the movement and change and the evolution versus revolution, etc. You cannot just have something completely and utterly different than your previous moment. It will always going to be something that you negate in this moment. Yes, Daniel.
So it's like, so like, Hegel is more Heraclitean, and then could we say like Kant is more Platonic then?
Sure, why not? If it helps you, I don't, yeah, it appears. Well, I mean, Hegel is not Heraclitean either, because Hegel thinks that there is a kind of combination of Heraclitus and Parmenides, as Josue in the other class. So no, but here the essential point is, for Hegel, you are defined by what you negate. Your identity is defined in terms of what you negate, and that also takes place in terms of time. So when you oppose to something and create a new world, which is what we are imagining constantly, like create a new world, etc., the limits of that world is going to be defined in terms of what is it that you negate. And that's has enormous political implications too, in terms of how he thinks about revolution. Like, he writes about the French Revolution, etc. How does that take place dialectically? Like historically, we explain a revolution, not something that sort of all of a sudden emerges out of the blue, but something that is a reaction to the past, a kind of negation of the past. So the future is always determined in terms of what it negates. And that's the nature of time. Now, dialectic is a shape of the movement. So this is always a determinate negation. You negate something determinate that determines what you are in the next moment.
When you say that identity is defined by what we negate, though, is that's implicating, because what I like when I read that, when I hear that, what I see is then sort of a new thing, like you know, like a revolution, a new thing. But you're saying that that's not a new thing, like it's more of a combination of what was, and then therefore it's not a new thing. It's sort of like a hybrid sort of
Well, that's a crucial question because for someone like Derrida, for example, when he talks about this concept of to come, he says the future needs to be radically open. And that's really the kind of level at which you are discussing the radical openness. It is very radical to be the total negation of the past. In a sense, that's very radical. But it is also not, because it is already structured in terms of what it radically negates. So it's always an opposition. So we'll start the question of postcolonial theory. I don't know, did you take postcolonial theory?
Yeah, I did.
So this is where we start. What does it mean to be a post? Like, is that defined in terms of what you negate, like your opposite or different, that how you define yourself in terms of post? Or is it something radically open, as Derrida wants to think? But that's impossible to even think, maybe, because all we can think is the negation of the past. So therefore, it is not programmable, it's not computable, it's not understandable. That is more radical than being a complete opposite. And that's really a philosophical question in terms of how you understand radicality of difference.
I remember being in this class and we were talking, it was Marxism with Jonathan, and we were talking about how within this conceptualization of like a revolution, something new, you can't have something new because like when you have this sort of like Marxist revolution, Marxism is really based on the economic system that was in place. Like the critique comes from that place. Like it cannot exist without having that structure. So therefore, like you can't say, let's create something new. And like people often mistake it with saying like, oh yeah, like let's just revolutionize and create something entirely like out of place. But that's impossible. Is that what we're talking about then?
Well, this is exactly why Marx is a Hegelian, precisely because like something like socialism is not even like a revolution that you can as a subject bring about. Socialism is really something that is born out of the contradictions of the previous stage, namely capitalism. So you don't even have to bring revolution. All you have to be is actually democrat, like democratic, not democratic, but because if means of production is controlled by 1% of the people and 99% of the people are not participating in this. So it's kind of almost an inevitable consequence of the distribution of the means of production for Marx. Now, of course, this is a very simple model. I'm sure there are a lot of complications in that I'm sort of glossing over, but the basic structure is the same in terms of tomorrow is only going to be the negation of today. Tomorrow can be a revolution, it can be a repetition, and the radicality of it depends on how radically it negates the past, but that's all it can be. It is the negation of the past. It can be something completely unpredictable, unknowable, as Derrida wants the future to be. Derrida thinks that the future has to be something to come, which is completely unprogrammed, unpredictable. And you can't even call it future. I mean, he doesn't even call it future because future is already defined in terms of homogeneous model of time in which now moves by negating the previous now.
How does Derrida deal with that then, in light of Hegel?
Well, yeah, that's complicated. I mean, that's the origin of the term, not difference, but difference, which is not an oppositional difference. Because the crucial question is like, can you have a difference without opposition? Can you have a radical difference without that being the opposite of the previous one? So that's pretty much, I think, like, if not the whole, at least significant aspect of Derrida's thinking of how you can think of the difference without opposition. But that's another course. I mean, you just wanted a course on Hegel. Now it's Derrida. So
Farid,
yes,
but Hegel doesn't think like Derrida, right? Because the opposition still means that something is programmable.
yes,
Okay.
yes. True negation. So let's finish section 96. This self-maintaining now.
Self-maintaining now. This self-maintaining now is thus not an immediate now, but a mediated now, for it is determined as an enduring and self-maintaining now as a result of another not existing, namely, the day or the night. Thereby, it is just as simply as it was before, now, and in this simplicity it is indifferent to what is still in play alongside it. As little as night and day are its being, it is just as much night and day. It is not affected at all by this, its otherness. Such an example is through negation. It is neither this nor that. It is both a not this, and it is just as indifferent to being this or that. And such a simple is what we call universal. The universal is thus, in fact, the truth of sensuous certainty.
Okay, so this is first definition of allgemein, the universal for Hegel. So I keep telling you about the universality of the concept, and this is how it emerges. It is different in different stages, but the same logic in terms of it is neither this nor that, it is both. And that's when I do this with respect to particular objects, that becomes kind of confusing and maybe not as clear, but with the now it is pretty clear, but it also applies to regular concepts too, because each regular concept is actually a movement coming to its own essence. Therefore, maybe it is not an empirical concept, that you can never bring the concept of book to its fruition, but a concept in the sense of now, which is not an empirical, but a rational concept that can be brought into its fruition. So, and there are complicated things, of course, like for Hegel, state is something like that, for example. Is state an empirical example, or does it have a logic? Does it have its own inner essence that it can bring about? And every concept is universal in that particular sense that it is constructed through negation. And therefore, universal is not some free-floating Platonic form type of thing, which people understood as belonging to a different world or something like that. But universal is really the movement of consciousness through each particular negation. Therefore, you have the necessary contribution of consciousness in understanding universality, because universality doesn't really exist in the same way particular objects exist. But it does exist conceptually. And it is nothing wrong for consciousness to contribute to it. In fact, thereby consciousness reveals the truth of the world.
Read on that last sentence in that paragraph where it says the universal is the truth of sensuous certainty. Like what? Like I'm not too sure what he's saying there. I'm not sure where he is in that statement. Whether like is whether we're back at the position that sense of certainty is actually mediated because of those internal differences, or where he's taking sense of certainty as like our desire for immediacy. I'm not sure where we are when he says that last line. And then like, is this also maybe this like the way he uses truth here, is it connected to the thing in the preface about the true being the whole?
Oh, absolutely. This is truth being the whole. In fact, he said that quite explicitly somewhere, that the truth of uncertainty lies in the whole. I think it's the beginning of in the whole experience. But okay, now he says that it is the universal. You can simply think of it in this way. Like whenever I say now, I am trying to point out to this particular manifestation, right? Example. But what I'm expressing is actually a universal. And this is the sort of paradox of uniqueness. Like every moment is unique, but that uniqueness can only be expressed in a way that it is universal to all of them. So when I say now, I'm actually trying to express the most immediate particular, while I end up expressing is the most general universal. So when I say I, everybody can say hi. Therefore, when Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, nobody says, oh, that's Descartes. Who cares about him? He is the one who thinks, therefore who is. No, I is what linguists call a shifter. Therefore, it is the most universal and hence the emptiest concept, because what appears to be most immediate, particular, singular, turns out to be the most abstract universal. Now, of course, that means universal is not abstract. You have to go through this, and we'll still go through this. And you're right. We just said that it is the universal, but we haven't completely explained the process of mediation yet. How is it that now becomes the universal? How is it that now is now? He hasn't demonstrated that yet. So he's going to go back and say, oh, it is I who is holding all these nows together. Oh, it is now that is holding all the I's together. Therefore, the universal here is not just an empty formal universal, as I just did, as I just explained, but it is the movement that goes together from the subject to the object and back to the subject, etc. So it's the movement again. So it has to be concretely expressed. And he is going to do that, starting with 10, well, really like 100, 101, and 102. So he hasn't done that yet. So he mentioned that now is the universal, but he hasn't demonstrated that yet. And the example I gave is kind of misleading because that's an empty formal, but just to illustrate the point, when I say now, I mean this now, but I'm expressing the most universal. And then the consciousness is sort of in this dilemma. It's like, I want to name it. I want to name it with the most immediate possible designation, which is most unique to this moment. And I want to say now, but whatever I say turns out to be something that is applicable to all the nows. So there's a certain strange coincidence with the most universal and the most particular. Yes.
So when we like say something, like when we refer to the noun in a particular, like in like an instance, it's already indicating like the universalness. Okay.
He says, I cannot say what I mean. I cannot say I. I cannot say I. because when I say I'm already referring to everybody. So I cannot even express my, and then he says later on, this is the most immediate, the most, what is called unsayable is nothing other than the untrue, the irrational, and what is merely fancy. Like we imagine this kind of unsayable, immediate uniqueness of my experience, which we love actually, like today. Like we all think that our experiences are unique and completely us, and we can't even express it. In a sense, that's the emptiest and the most universal expression.
What would you have to say about this and meditation?
This one?
Like this that we're doing now, like especially 96. Would you relate that to meditation? Meditation, as in what it is now.
As in now? Like
It's yeah, because it sounds like to me, it sounds like, you know, when I read it, it somehow sounds like phenomenology, some sort of higher. I don't even want to say this higher meditation. It's just.
Are you talking about like meditation, like some kind of like sitting up, like meditation?
Yeah, I know.
Meditation.
Sorry, like yeah, I'm talking about that contemporary, yeah, meditation.
Oh, so like this process being a meditation?
In a way, yes.
But I mean, isn't all philosophy that? To me, it's always that. So I mean, I mean, yes, phenomenology is kind of very interesting text, and but all philosophical reading should be like that, isn't it? I don't know. Maybe it's just like depends, I guess. I mean, meditation in that sense, but yeah, I don't know.
Pretty asked on this same paragraph too. So is he sort of, to me, what I also got is there an implication that like even like language itself, the way we express things is like consists of negativity, like
Yeah.
okay.
But I mean, negativity in the sense that when in language I express the universal. So language is always, as he says later, and we'll come to this. Language expresses the truth because it is the if of the universal. So we want to express the particular by using the universal, but what we express is actually the truth of the particular because of the language. So what we are trying to express is not even true, actually. It is merely fancied, which is, okay, it sounds a little sort of counterintuitive or sort of problematic because for Hegel, even that which we consider to be prior to language is something that is expressed in language. So whenever people say like, oh, I cannot express what I feel, it's like, you just express it as that which you cannot express. So that's the only access you have to it. You like, because if you really like couldn't express, you wouldn't even express it, like that which I cannot express. So, but that's sort of that poetic language or something like that. Like poetry does something that language cannot touch. And it's like, no way. Like that's exactly what language can touch. So he does see that aspect, but we'll come to that. We'll come to that specifically. Now, we also express, and this is, he jumps ahead, but that's fine. This is 97. We also express the sensuous as a universal, but what we say is this, the universal this. We say it is being as such. We thereby, of course, do not represent to ourselves the universal, vorstellen, this or being as such, but we express the universal. That is aussprechen, to speak up, speak up, speak out. Or in this sensuous certainty, we do not at all say what we mean. Mean also means meinen, which also means that which is mine, which becomes even more obvious when we do the same thing in terms of the I. Now we are doing it in terms of now, but we'll do the same thing in terms of the I. I cannot express the sort of uniqueness, singularity of the I either, because every single moment is universal. However, we see language is the more truthful. In language, we immediately refute what we mean to say, and since the universal is the truth of sensuous certainty, and language only expresses this truth, it is in that way not possible at all we could say what we mean about sensuous being. We mean to say something, we can't say it, but by not saying it, we are saying the truth. Because the truth of sense certainty is the universal, not the particular that it is after. Now, with time, it is more obvious to me, obviously, because it is one moment negates the other. But in 98, there's this strange recognition that you can actually maybe stay with this moment in terms of the space. And he says, for the space here to behave like the now, I need to turn. And I always thought this paragraph was a little mysterious because the same comes up in the form of the other this, namely in the here. For here is the tree. That's what S was saying. I turn around. Like with time, I don't even have to do anything. With time, it's just going to be past. But here I turn around. And it's like, okay, what if you don't turn around?
Isn't that the point, I guess? That like the sort of like the metaphor of turning is like I guess like while, for example, the now would be like with time you don't have to really do anything, but I guess with like the here it's sort of like consciousness orients itself towards like another space or something along those lines.
Sure.
Like yeah, there's like a yeah.
Well, I mean, you see that sort of they are not maybe parallel, but the other question is like, if I just keep looking at the here, the house, is that going to be any different than house here now, house here not now? Because even I just concentrate on the house long enough, I don't know how long, that house is going to be something different. That's the nature of reality. So space is in time, as Kant was having, not that time is in space, which is a very important actually distinction. A lot of people, like when we represent time to ourselves, we reduce time to space, but we can't. So that he says that here behaves just like now, which I just leave it as a question. Again, I like time because I expressed the transcendental deduction as he did in terms of time as well. This seems to be working better to me, more compelling in terms of time. So what we gain through this is, while this sensuous certainty has proved in its own self that the universal is the true of its object, to it pure being therefore remains as its essence, but not as immediate. Rather, it remains as to which negation and mediation are essential. Now, you haven't demonstrated that yet. He will, but he says it. And in thereby does not continue to be what we mean by the term being, rather what we mean is being with the determination, such that it is the abstraction or the purely universal, and what we mean to say, for which the truth of sense certainty is not the universal, is all that remains apart from this empty or indifferent now and here. So now he is going to describe the movement of sense certainty, but okay, so I don't know the status of 99. I don't know whether he has the right to say all of these yet. Now there's just this empty now, indifferent to X, Y, Z, but there is also a constituted now, and we need to concentrate on the constitution. So that starts with 100, with paragraph 100. Let's read that. 100.
If we compare the relation in which knowing and the object first came on the scene with the relations in which they came to stand in the result, then the relation has reversed itself. The object, which was supposed to be what was essential to sensuous certainty, is now the inessential, since the universal, which the object has come to be, is no longer the kind of universal which the object was essentially supposed to be for sensuous certainty.
Okay, so do you
Rather,
understand what he says here, that this reversed, but he didn't explain to us how it reversed. And did you understand the reverse? Reverse in the sense that the certainty would go from the object to the subject, from the now to the I. But why? It hasn't come yet, but okay, keep reading, please. Yeah.
I thought it had sort of come a little, like in like floating, like yeah, like he hadn't like felt. I don't know. I thought like if like 93 and 94 sort of like hints at that, like those paragraphs about this reversal of the relation, and then like 97 through 99 talk about like the changing of the universal, and I guess like those four together with this one sort of work.
You're right. I think that he is hinted at that, but did he demonstrate the role of the I as a mediation in the universality of the now? So pay attention, that is missing. That is missing. He said it, that the now is a universal, but for the now to be a universal, there needs to be a mediation through the I, through the opposite, because he said it is mediation, negation. What is it? That hasn't happened yet, or he hasn't said it yet, and he will just say it now. So continue, please, Esther.
rather, sensuous certainty is now present in what is opposed to it, namely in the knowing which previously was the inessential. Its truth is in the object as my object, or in what I mean. The object is because I know it. Sensuous certainty is, to be sure, thus driven out of the object, but it is not yet thereby sublated. Rather, it is only pushed back into the I, and it is still to be seen what experience will show us about sensuous certainty's reality.
Okay, continue.
Mhm. The force of its truth thus lies now in the I, in the immediacy of my seeing, hearing, etc. The disappearance of the singular now and here that we mean is deterred by I hold fast to them. Now is daytime because I see it, here is a tree for precisely the same reason. However, sensuous certainty experiences in these relationships the same dialectic as it did within the preceding relationships. I, this, see the tree and assert the tree to be here. However, another I sees the house and asserts that there is no tree, but there is no tree here, but rather a house. Both truths have the same warrant, namely the immediacy of seeing and the surety and assurance which both have about their knowing. However, one vanishes into the other.
Okay, so what is happening here? This is the crucial element. This is a little bit like the unity that we were talking about in Kant. This is similar to transcendental unity of a perception. So for the now to remain as now while changing. So now is night, now is day, etc. The presupposition that there is a necessary unity attributed to the now, that unity is provided by the I. I hold them first together. I hold them together. I produce the unit or supply the unity that is necessary for the now to be different in each instances, yet the same. This is again a kind of Kantian notion of putting different presentations under one presentation in a more elemental level, not at the Kantian level, but it is a synthesis. It is a much basic synthesis than Kant, because this is the sense certainty. Kant was already describing a complicated process of perception with respect to manifolds, etc. But the logic of it is the same. So now can be universal. It cannot disappear, but can be held together by the I. So I, through mediation with the I, now reveals itself as a universal. So this is our relationship to time. That's like, with respect to human consciousness, time has a different manifestation in the world, which is complicated now. But he reverses that immediately. I mean, he just said it, like, let's stick with it for a while and try to explain it. No, he immediately turns, but this I is different than this I. The I of the now one is the I of the, is not the I of the now two. I can only ascertain the unity of the I's with respect to the unity of the now. So then it becomes a mutual constitution. Neither is prior to the other. So neither the subject nor the object has that continuity that is necessary for one to be the universal, but they constitute each other mutually by negating each other. So in this relational opposition, Hegel constructs the movement and hence the universal. My unity depends on the unity of the object. The unity of the object depends on my unity. And they mutually construct each other. No unity is prior. Nothing is like there is a transcendental unity of a perception or transcendental unity of the world. They construct each other in relation to each other. And it's always a tenuous construction. But in sense certainty, to reach the universal, that's how we reach it. Because I say now, 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 and then how am I the same I in this now, now, now? It's because of the now. So now, this doesn't construct a kind of transcendental unity, a huge kind of sort of consistency of the world, etc. This is really relative and limited to the unity that is necessary in sense certainty. From this, he is not constructing an entire metaphysics or anything like that. He is just producing the unity of sense certainty. It is a universal, it's a movement. And it's going to be even more complicated when we come to 106. But in all this, what does not disappear is I as universal. Now, this is one side, of course. Whose seeing is neither a seeing of the tree nor of this house. Rather, it's a simple seeing, which is mediated by the negation of this house and so forth. It is therein just as simple and indifferent towards that which is still in play in the background vis-a-vis the house and the tree. So it's not the tree, it is not essentially any of those things. So they are indifferent to the content. It is only universal in the way that now, here, or this is universal. So I has the same structure as the now. To be sure, an individual I, but I can no more say what I mean by now, here, than I can say what I mean by I. So I couldn't say now, like this moment, without expressing the universal, and I cannot say the same, this unique I here, without expressing the universal. While I say this here, this now, or a singular, I say all this is, all here's, nows, or singulars. Likewise, in what I say I, this singular I, what I say is all I. that's the universal too. So what appears to be the most elemental and singular, like now, is now like I, behaves exactly in the same way. Each is what I say it is, I, this singular. However, much this demand is set before science as its touchstone, a demand which it would probably surely not last out, namely that it deduce, construct, find a priori, or however one wishes to express it, the so-called this thing or this person. Still, it is reasonable that the demand should state which of the many things this thing or which of the I's this means. But it's impossible to state this. It is impossible to state this. So what Kant does is a jump in transcendental unity of a perception. So it is the whole. Here he says, neither this nor that. It is the whole. It is the movement. Here he says, when he said, like, Daniel, when you refer to the preface, sensuous certainty thereby learns from experience that its essence is neither in the object nor in the eye. So now sense certainty is aware of this. Sense certainty, not just Hegel phenomenology, but when we look at the objects and try to get sense certainty, that sense certainty as a form of consciousness becomes aware of the fact that certainty is neither in the object nor in the self exclusively. And that the immediacy is an immediacy of neither one nor the other of them, for in both, what I mean is instead what is inessential and the object and I are universals in which the now and the here and the I that I mean do not endure or are not. So sense certainty exhausts itself. It moves. It cannot stay there. It doesn't discover any truth other than its own truth, right? We thereby come to posit the whole of sense certainty itself as its essence, and no longer only as a moment of sensuous certainty, as happened in both cases, in which at first the object opposed to the I, and then the I itself were each supposed to be the reality of sense certainty. It is thus only the whole of sensuous certainty itself which clings tenaciously in such sensuous certainty to immediacy, and which thereby excludes from itself all the opposition who took place in what preceded. So it tries to avoid the oppositions, it tries to have the immediacy, but what it ends up having is this movement in which the truth of sense certainty is revealed. Now we repeat this in 106 and 107, but again, it's finished now. He said everything that he said. Now he's going to go back and say it again.
So when he says, like, in that paragraph, that it's not just a moment, right? We shouldn't take it as like this singular thing that occurs. But because I thought initially, what I thought initially was that part of what Hegel is trying to do in general is like, okay, wait, never mind. I think I answered my own question in my head. That's fine. So like it's not just moments, but it's like the development of those moments in like a movement, is it? Yeah.
The totality of the movement. I mean, that's really you go through these movements and then you come up with something. And that's going to be universal. But that universal is going to be what consciousness takes to be true. And that's Wahrnehmen, that's perception. So when we perceive, we don't perceive this, we perceive a property. We perceive a property of an object, we perceive blackness. So it's now this became more differentiated, more determined. Now it is the property of an object, right? So that became more concrete because sense certainty, this desire to be certain, is abstract. And that's really the predicament of modern science. We want to be certain. What can you be certain about? You can be certain about mathematics. You can demonstrate it with proof because it is the most abstract. So to the extent that you can calculate anything, you can treat everything as if they are monochromatically the same. That's the nature of precision. You can be precise about abstract things. You cannot be precise about concrete things. It really boggles my mind that people are still using this concept of abstract in almost the opposite way of what abstract means. I mean, I really want to kill myself when I hear this. Just like, this is enough. Like, oh, this is so abstract. Mathematics is so concrete. It's like, you're an idiot. Mathematics is the most abstract. How can you even like imagine mathematics becoming concrete just because you can get precision? You can get precision with concrete. You can get precision with the abstract. Okay, I imagine like there's nobody like that, but I imagine people saying that and then I get angry at them in my head. So this, I mean, it's like, isn't this so precise? It's this, look, that. It's like, it's almost like this mathematical desire to catch something like quantity, right? But that's the most abstract. So concreteness is not simplicity. Concreteness is further determination. Further you determine, further you have characteristics that you attribute to it, and that was with Kant too, the more concrete it becomes and less precise and more difficult to know. So when I say like philosophy asks questions about life and existence and go, oh, these are such abstract questions. It's ridiculous. But if you describe your life as a chemical combination, that's very concrete, sure. That really captures who you are. Okay, philosophy doesn't make you happy. It makes you really unhappy. Like, because it really sort of, like when people use this expression, that makes you really like, yeah, unhappy. Okay, do you want to continue? So we were 104. Are you tired, Esther? Okay.
Okay. 104. This pure immediacy therefore no longer has any concern with the otherness of the here as a tree, which is a here that is a non-tree, nor with the otherness of now as a daytime, which passes over into a now that is night, nor with another I, for which something other is the object. Its truth is preserved as a self-consistent relation, which makes no difference of essentiality and non-essentiality between the I and the object, and into which therefore no difference at all can force its entry. This I, assert therefore that here is a tree, and it is not the case that I turn around so that the here would become for me not a tree, or that I myself at another time take the here not to be a tree, and the now not to be the daytime, etc. Rather, I'm pure intuiting, and I stick with, namely, that now is daytime, or else I also stick with here is a tree. I also do not compare the here and the now themselves with each other. Rather, I cling tenaciously to immediate relation. Now it is daytime.
Now, why am I doing all of these things? Did we go back again? What happened?
What?
Is this that thing where the consciousness clings to that immediacy, to whatever you see in that moment? sticking with now it is daytime instead of understanding that the movement between day and night is under the same now.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is again a moment of consciousness. That's a moment of sense certainty. So sense certainty, not, you can't accept that because it has to be the object. And even at the end of sense certainty, it is going to be something that constantly pushes it outside. So sense certainty is not comfortable with just, oh, this is something that I construct in relation to the object and then myself, etc. It clings to that externality. Now it's the object. That's the certainty. So that's the immediacy. Self-consciousness doesn't yet recognize the mediation. But mediation is also always going to be relative to what you are mediating with. So sense certainty might say, oh, I might have mediated that with respect to the object in sense certainty, but when I come to perception, this is the object. So you constructed the object in relation to your consciousness, but you still attribute it to the object. Because that object is the negation of the relationship between consciousness of a previous stage and the object of that consciousness at the previous stage. So I have a little diagram, which I'm going to explain this perfectly on Thursday, but that's what we were discussing in the preface. So there's another object, negation. So object always emerges as the negation of consciousness, right? Consciousness negating something and then making it an object. So you construct in sense certainty an object, which is a relationship between sense certainty and its object. But whatever that object is, you still push it outside, negate it, and say, this is something that I know from the external world. This is not something that I create, manufacture. So consciousness always negates itself. I mean, always in the sense that differently at different stages, negates itself and consider what it knows as an object as its opposite. So it does that in sense certainty, it does that in perception, it does that in understanding. So consciousness always creates that object, creates only from our perspective, creates, but from the perspective of consciousness by negating itself. That's the opposite. It's my other, that which can be known from outside, pushes it outside of itself. I might have done this in the past, but I'll still push it outside. I might recognize that, well, it doesn't know that yet, but it will again be a mediation, but I push it outside as an object.
Why does he say that when the truth is presumed as a relation, no difference can force an entry?
Well, that's the insistence of sense certainty, as Esther said. That's not phenomenological perspective. Sense certainty was a no, nothing can force its entry, right? So that is the attitude of, that's why it's confusing. That's the attitude of sense certainty itself, not what we have discovered. We have already discovered, as Esther said, that this is actually mediation. Is that what you said? I think that.
Something like that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Since this certainty itself thereby no longer wishes to step forward when we draw its attention to a now that is night, or to an I for which it is night, we step up to it and let ourselves point to the now that is asserted. It's like, what are you talking about? Who are these things? So this certainty, like when you have the certainty of the universal, consciousness wants to stay there. So he is describing this process of mediation all over again. We must let ourselves point to it, for the truth of this immediate relation is the truth of this this I, which limits itself to a now or to a here. If we are afterwards to take up this truth or to stand at a distance from it, it would have no meaning at all, for we would sublate the immediacy that is essential to it. Thus, we must enter into the same point of time and space, point it to ourselves, allow ourselves to be made into the same I as that is a knowing with certainty. Let us see therefore how what is immediate, which is pointed out to us, is composed. So let's just take the position of consciousness again, and let's do this again. I mean, you already said that this has already done. But let's do it again. Let's put ourselves into the position of consciousness and how it does when it says now. So he is redescribing the process. Therefore, it gets confusing because you think that we are done with this. We already finished this. Why are you going back? He is going back. Okay, so that is 106 and 107. Maybe we'll do that on Thursday. So no new reading other than I'll ask you to read 3 pages. 106, 107, 108, 109, 110. That's it. So read it again, and I think that's enough. Any questions?
Fareed, so is perception, is there a difference between sense-certainty and perception, or is perception just has the quality of sense-certainty?
Perception is going to take the object that is created by sense-certainty, namely the universal property. So it is further determination. It is not this, but it is this particular property. Then you will see the property as the property of an object. Then we will see object with properties. That will be the object of understanding. That is already what in Kant was defined as Gegenstand. Therefore, he is further determining what the object of knowledge is at different levels of consciousness. So the object of sense certainty is not the same as the object of perception. The object of perception is more concrete, further determined. Now, is it the object as the same movement? Yes, that's the object of knowledge, object of epistemology, object of consciousness, but it's not always the same. That object is also consists of negation, because the object of sense certainty, the object of perception is the negation of the object of sense certainty. Yes, Daniel.
So like sense certainty in Hegel just takes a sense of like he's investigating it as like just like direct, not direct, but like first contact with things, and then perception is sort of like is perception like the second order of that to some degree.
Further determined, more concrete, because nobody says this, that, right? We say blue, green, yellow, or it's taste this blah blah, whatever we say, like this tastes bitter. So that's property already, like belongs to the world. It belongs to somebody. It's not this abstract this, it is the green patch of this book. So what we know with respect to what corresponds to our consciousness is different. So therefore, when people say like, do I know the object? It's like, what do you mean by object? Like you can mean many different things by the word object. And that object is going to become more and more concrete, not necessarily immediate, in fact, further and further mediated. And whenever it comes to me as an object like a book, is already gone through a number of processes of mediation. Maybe we'll continue with perception. That might be actually better than going back to, I mean, preface is beautiful, but it is difficult to wrap your mind around because you need to understand Hegel to read preface. So we might go back to introduction, but let's just stick with the some certainty for Thursday and then see where we can go from there, okay? Okay, well, have a good Wednesday. I'll see you Thursday.